We're now talking to the former Deputy Prime Minister, infrastructure spokesperson now for the Labor opposition, Anthony Albanese. Thanks for your company.
Good to be with you.
I want to ask you about something that you revealed during the week, that there was a preference arrangement or a deal being done between the Liberal Party and the Greens, particularly out of Victoria, but going more widely than that. You were very critical of it. Labor does preference arrangements all the time with the Greens. What's the difference?
Well, what we have here is a secret arrangement that Michael Kroger confirmed indeed on Sky News on Thursday when he called it a loose arrangement. Well, that's a euphemism for a deal. And the deal is that the Liberals would give preferences to the Greens candidates in seats where the Greens have a chance of winning.
Seats like yours?
Seats like mine and Sydney, held by Tanya Plibersek in New South Wales, and in Victoria, the seats of Wills, Batman and Melbourne. But in return, whilst the Greens will go round in my electorate and say, it's okay, we're giving Labor preferences, what the deal is in return is in other seats. So seats which are marginals, currently held by the Liberal Party, or ones they seek to win, like Bruce and Chisholm in Victoria, the Greens would issue essentially no direction of their preferences, a split ticket, an open ticket, and that would, of course, substantially increase the chances of the Conservative parties winning those seats. So,
but that's just smart electioneering, isn't it, by the government? I mean, I'm sure some of their members might not like it, which is why they've tried to keep it secret. But in terms of electoral politicking, it makes sense.
Well, it's duplicitous is what it is, because at the same time as the Liberals will be saying that they're totally opposed to the policies of the Greens political party, and the Greens are saying the same about the Liberals, they're entering into an arrangement which does two things. One, it increases the chances of Greens entering the House of Representatives at the expense of progressive Labor members. So that in itself doesn't change the dynamic, or the chances of the coalition forming government. But what does increase the chances of the coalition forming government after the election are these open tickets. Now, that's something that the Greens supporters don't want. The Liberal supporters don't want Greens in the House of Representatives. So we have an outcome where both political parties achieve the opposite of what they're arguing publicly.
One of the reasons that this can be considered or looked at by the Liberal Party is because of the removal of that interdependence between Labor delivering preferences to the Greens in the Senate, if there is electoral reform, vis-a-vis the Greens delivering preferences to Labor in the lower house. We spoke to Matthias Cormann, the Special Minister of State, a moment ago. He effectively denied that this was part of their calculation when looking at Senate reform. Are you sceptical?
Well, he did something even more bizarre than that. He suggested that it hadn't been any consideration. Now, the idea that a minister in the coalition government, deputy leader of the government in the Senate, has not given any consideration to the electoral implications of changes to the electoral system is, quite frankly, taking the electorate for mugs. And it's absurd. And quite clearly, I think that Matthias gave himself up when he gave that absurd answer, frankly. There is no doubt that this is at the heart of these changes and the deal around Senate changes between the Greens and the coalition, because what it does historically, in a transparent way, there's no problem with preferences. I've sat down and negotiated preferences with the Greens, with the Democrats, with everyone. We've never negotiated with the coalition, because the real game in Australian politics is who the government is. Is it the coalition or Labor? So we don't negotiate with the coalition, but of course we've negotiated with other parties, and I've done it as a party official. The idea that the Greens say we decide our preferences locally, frankly, I've sat down in rooms, I've had discussions with Greens leaders at state and federal level, and the truth is that they enter into these negotiations.
Now, as a result of this arrangement that you're talking about, to what extent do you think there is a real threat to some sitting Labor members, such as yourself, such as Tanya Plibersek? Is this threat to existing Labor members significant?
Well, it's been reduced by the fact that this has been exposed, Paul, which is why I called it out on This Week and publicly.
So what's the effect of this exposure?
Well, I think that Greens party members who are weighing up whether they'll vote for the Greens or Labor will take this into consideration and will say, well, maybe, just maybe, these people under Richard Di Natale aren't the purists that they say they are.
So you think there might be some sort of grassroots revolt by Green supporters and voters against these deals?
Well, there'll be a big reaction. The Greens candidate for the state seat of Heffron, which is in part in my electorate, in part a bit of it's in the electorate of Sydney, has been out there being very critical of the Greens for pretending this loose arrangement is not a deal. And so we've had that emerge within their party. And a whole lot of, I'm not critical of people who choose to vote Green or choose to vote what have you. That's up to them in the democratic process. What I'm critical of here is the fact that there was an attempt to hide this from the public, just as Matthias Cormann's statement of we've had no political consideration of the implications is just absurd.
But is it equally...
Now, I guess the question is, what's happening here with the bigger picture? We've just seen this deal between the Greens and the government over Senate voting reform. Do you think that under Malcolm Turnbull's leadership, we're likely to see the government moving closer to the Greens on a series of tactical issues? Is this what's going to happen, and is this a significant change?
Well, that's possible, but of course what you've got is Malcolm Turnbull not standing for anything at the moment. I mean, he's a blank page. He had a plan to get rid of Tony Abbott, but he doesn't have a plan to govern, and that's more and more obvious for all to see. Under those circumstances, in the lead up to an election, what we're seeing is more and more arrangements between the Greens and the coalition, including over so-called Senate reform. I mean, you could have reformed the Senate in a really practical way by doing measures like having a threshold beyond which, if you didn't reach that, you couldn't be elected and your preferences were automatically redistributed. There's a range of measures that you could have done which weren't about disenfranchising the more than 20% of voters who choose to vote for neither Labor, Liberal, National or Greens.
Just on the Senate voting changes in general, just as a matter of principle, wouldn't it be better if whoever was in government, whether it was a coalition or the Labor Party, that they had a greater chance of getting their legislation through the Senate? Because in recent history, it's been very hard for governments to get the legislation through the Senate, at least the big picture pieces of legislation. And so just as a general principle, would you like to see a voting system whereby the Senate was more aligned with the lower house in general?
Well, that's an argument for a unicameral system of just one house, and we don't have that. We have a House of Review, and frankly, I think the Senate has done its job during this term. The Senate has rejected many of the more extreme and harsh and unfair measures of the 2014 budget.
It's more a House of rejection, though, really, than a House of Review.
That's not right. Most legislation has got through the Senate, but legislation also gets improved by proper scrutiny. And you have two problems, I think. One is the quality of the legislation, which has been pretty poor, which has been quite contrary to what the government said it would do prior to its election. Remember the famous dictum, no cuts to health, no cuts to education, no cuts to pensions, no cuts to the ABC. So the Senate has done its job in representing what the Australian people wanted. In other areas, it's simply been a failure by a government that has failed to transition from opposition.
But notwithstanding, though, Mr Albanese, notwithstanding that it has done its job in terms of limiting the mandate because of those pre-election comments from the former Prime Minister, Labor can't seriously feel good about defending the status quo structure, can they, which sees these preference harvesting arrangements between micro-parties, and it sees the likes of Ricky Muir getting elected with an absolute fraction of the vote.
We don't defend that, and I just put forward, Peter, to you a practical and easily implementable way in which you could avoid that to be the case. And
but will Labor put that forward, though? Will it put that forward as an alternative?
There's a fix, Peter. There's a fix, and the fix is in. It's in between the Coalition and the Greens, and it's a part of a lower house deal. They're trying to pretend nothing to see here. We haven't considered the politics, and frankly, they are taking the Australian people for mugs if they think that there won't be proper scrutiny of this. And the last time, of course, a political party had power in both houses, what we got was work choices. And the chances of both houses being held by the Coalition are significantly increased by this change, because the Coalition has a higher primary vote just across every single state of Australia than Labor. There is a greater chance that as a result of these changes, the Coalition in normal Senate elections over a period of time will get 3 out of 6 in every state and 1 in the territories, which means that the Coalition will be in a position to block legislation at least. And that's why we don't think that the Greens political party have thought this through. I mean, this is going to lead to a double D election. One of their South Australian senators will be knocked off, and it doesn't make any sense unless you look at the deals over the House of Reps versus the Senate by breaking that nexus between the Greens needing Labor preferences to get senators elected, and in return the Greens assisting Labor to win marginal seats in the House of Representatives. That's the real big game that's been on here. You picked it very early on, but the truth is that the Greens and the Coalition are pretending nothing to see here. Well, that's the main game.
We're going to take a break here on Australian Agenda. We're speaking to Anthony Albanese. When we come back, we'll delve into his portfolio area of infrastructure. Back in a sec.
Booking a hotel? Hotels Combined has the best selection of offers and deals all in one place. Simply search, select your options and find a great hotel deal on every device. Compare with the Bear at Hotels Combined.
Life expectancy is up, but what about lifestyle expectancy? Share market falls can leave serious dents in your retirement savings, but a Challenger guaranteed annuity is protected from market crashes. Google Challenger Annuities.
With a new look and new tech including Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, the new Holden Captiva is the SUV for your little troopers.
Paid too much for glasses? Should have gone to Specsavers. Designer glasses from $89, complete with standard single vision lenses. Only at Specsavers.
She has a rash on her neck, which is so stiff and sore. And the
pain in my leg. It's like a circumcision. Just not sure whether it's gonna look
like an old dinosaur. But I'm having
painful periods, and it's giving me
nightmares about
my cat allergy from Tiggles, who has
menopause. So I'm taking
ice. I was at this party with my mate, and he
hits me. And I'm so scared of tingling in my arms
that are all broken.
and I was
like, I don't know, hoping you could help me. Sure. Okay, let's have a look.
The Good GP is with the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, because the Good GP never stops learning.
So I said to the travel agent, only 4 flights? Like, we knew there were heaps more from looking online. And she goes, maybe 5? And we thought, we're not stupid. We could do better than that ourselves. So we did.
With international travel, one site lets you see and compare all your available airfare choices to actually book the best deal.
I know for next time.
Make your own way in the world with Webjet.
Sundays on Carvelis, issues that matter round the nation, debates that dig deep into big election questions, and what politicians say about themselves. Join guest host Christina Keneally on Carvelis, Sky News Live.
Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda, where Adam Crichton, Paul Kelly and I are speaking to the former Deputy Prime Minister, current Labor spokesperson for infrastructure, Anthony Albanese. Mr Albanese, you were saying before the break about the sort of, in a sense, lack of ideas that are coming out of the government and the new Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. But during the week, he gave some meat on the bones around cities policies, which was relatively substantive, wasn't it?
Well, he showed that he'd read my city's policy announcement at the National Press Club in 2014.
You're not accusing him of plagiarism, mate.
He spoke of it. Well, people can look at it and they'll read into it whatever they think themselves on my Facebook page. But the idea of the 30-minute city, speaking about drive-in, drive-out suburbs, because the State of Australian Cities reports have shown that the jobs that are being created are essentially around the CBD and 10 kilometres around. As we transition, as the growth sector becomes financial services, legal services, other economic activity, as opposed to manufacturing and other areas that tend to be in the outer suburbs.
Can I just ask though, Mr Albanese, it looks like the government's going to go hard on this. They're going to see this as part of their mixed innovative and growth agenda. If the Labor Party, if they've, albeit via imitation being the greatest form of flattery, taken a lot of what you've said on this, they're still going to get political credit for it. They're still going to develop a narrative around how to, grow the economy as a result of this policy.
Look, if they adopt our policies, we're happy with that. But they'll need to, before they get any credit for new initiatives, they need to start with putting the funding back for the Melbourne Metro, the funding back for the Brisbane Cross River Rail project, the funding back for Tonsley Park, the funding back for public transport in Perth, both light and heavy rail, that they cut in the 2014 budget. That's before they start with any new initiatives. They've got to repair the damage that's been done in terms of the urban policy agenda that Labor had established in government. They need to set up a body like we did, the Major Cities Unit, to drive that change. Looking importantly, not just at capital cities, but also looking at regional cities and how they can take pressure off, particularly the big capital cities on the East Coast. So the government, we welcomed when they announced a Minister for Cities, but of course that didn't make it till Christmas due to circumstances that weren't about policy. But then when Malcolm Turnbull had his reshuffle, he downgraded it to a parliamentary secretary position. We still have no Major Cities Unit or bureaucracy. We still have no urban policy agenda. We still have no significant funding of public transport. The only announcement we've had is $95 million for Gold Coast Light Rail Stage 2. We, of course, put $365 million into Stage 1, and the $95 million was taken from a saving on the Moreton Bay rail link that was funded by federal Labor and state Labor. Yeah. So we've had no new initiatives from this government. And on Friday, the big announcement of Malcolm Turnbull was that an aspiration, not a policy. He suggested, if you read one of the front pages, that we're going to get fast rail to Badgerys Creek, which is what we've been saying. It needs to be linked, the new airport, to a rail line from day one. But there was no route, no funding, no mechanism, no identification of what sort of rail line it would be. It was really just an aspiration. Now, after 3 years, he needs to do better than that.
Now, in office last time, you did a lot of work on high-speed rail on the East Coast, and you've argued that this works in economic terms. You said the other day, the question now is whether we've got a government prepared to make the big call on high-speed rail, whether we're talking Sydney, Melbourne, some other East Coast arrangement. Would a Labor government in office make the call?
Well, we would, and we have a private member's bill before the Parliament right now to establish a high-speed rail authority. That was recommended by the advisory group that I established. It included people like Jennifer Westercott from the Business Council of Australia, Tim Fisher. This wasn't an airy-fairy group. This was a very serious group who looked at the economics of this project and found, for example, from Sydney to Melbourne, the benefit was over $2 for every dollar that would be invested. So what I announced this week at the Sydney Institute was that we would take it a step further and task that authority at the appropriate time to call for expressions of interest from global players in the high-speed rail industry.
In other words, you're pressing the starter's gun on this project?
Well, what we want to see is what these global players have to offer. We have had, and so has the government, no doubt, significant players from China, Japan, Europe, coming through our doors saying, we think we can make this work. It's quite clear that we should use that international expertise. It's clear also that if you look at overseas, all of, or just about all of the high-speed rail projects that work effectively are partnerships between government and the private sector. So we think the logical next step is to ask the authority that needs to be established to coordinate through the different levels of government and with the private sector to call for an expressions of interest at the appropriate time.
Now, what are we talking about here? We're talking about a Sydney-Melbourne link via Canberra. Is that essentially what we're talking about?
Brisbane through to Melbourne.
Brisbane through to Melbourne.
Via Sydney and Canberra.
OK, now will you put this to the election as part of Labor's campaign?
Well, we've been campaigning on this. We have been campaigning on this for years since we received the report.
Well, there are campaigns and there are campaigns, as you would appreciate. Will you put this front and centre as part of Labor's election campaign?
We think this is a significant part of Labor's vision when it comes to nation building. And I have no doubt it has significant public support, but importantly also, it has significant support from the business community who understand in terms of the government talks about value capture. Well, here it is, both in terms of the Badgerys Creek rail line and high-speed rail. One of the things it would do is transform regional economies. If you could be in Newcastle or Canberra and be within 40 minutes of Sydney CBD, that would change the economic game.
Well, give us a sense. Can you give us a sense of how this would work for our viewers that are uninitiated to this? So if we're talking about a high-speed rail line between Sydney and Melbourne, it stops at Canberra on the way through. How long does it take to go between Sydney and Melbourne? What are we talking about?
You have two forms of, and the study identified this, we spent $20 million doing down to the design of stations. There's been a lot of work done on this. You would have express routes between Sydney, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. That would be under 3 hours. But then you would also have routes along the way that pick up, so they'd be slower obviously once you start stopping, but Southern Highlands, Canberra, Wagga Wagga, Albury Wodonga, Shepparton, Melbourne, and up the north coast from the central coast, Newcastle, the major cities along Taree, Port Macquarie, Coffs Harbour, Lismore, up to the Gold Coast. Now, what it showed was that it is those two things together that improve the economics of this project.
And is the theory that people can therefore live in the regions and with floating workplaces, they can work from home, they can
Absolutely, and that businesses can establish themselves in the CBD, say Newcastle, or Shepparton for that matter, and be able to be in close proximity, so if they need to get to Melbourne or Sydney for a meeting. Now at the moment, if you want to go to Sydney, Canberra, as I know full well, and I'll experience again this week, you know, I live almost at the end of the runway, but you've got to get to the airport, you wait for the plane, you wait for the gate. It's quite often late if it's at Sydney Airport. It's all dead time. The great benefit of why high-speed rail has worked around the world is that the convenience travellers vote for, and they vote for it with their feet. Very few people now go by plane from London to Paris. What they do is they go on the Euro.
Yes, but just on those two cities, they each have a population of about 10 million, and they're far, far closer together than Sydney and Melbourne are. I can't think of a country in the world with Australia's basic characteristics that has such high-speed rail between its major cities. I mean, Australia is enormous. I mean, that's, what, 1,000 kilometres between Sydney and Melbourne. I mean, how is that ever going to be viable when you've got both cities with only 4 million people in them?
And you need to get out more, Adam. You need to get out more. Go to Italy.
The US. Okay, go to Italy. The United States.
Go to Italy and have a look at the rail between Milan, Bologna, Rome. It has taken over the air route between Rome and
those cities are very close together, Milan, Bologna and Rome.
Well, they're not actually.
Probably a couple hundred kilometres.
Milan and Rome are certainly not a couple of hundred kilometres away. Madrid and Valencia, I've been on that route. Paris to Lyon. All of these routes effectively have been taken over in terms of rail travel. Paris to London, in terms of the distance that it used to take, has been transformed.
But I think at this point, though, I can see it between, for example, Canberra and Sydney, or Canberra and Melbourne. But then, of course, you've got the lack of population in Canberra, which is an issue. 3 hours as a trip between Sydney and Melbourne feels like it might just be a little too long.
Well, what the study did was show that rail was competitive with air travel for anything 3 hours and under. That's what the study looked at, the comprehensive examples. Sydney and Melbourne are both expected to grow to 8 million in terms of their population. Now, the big infrastructure challenge isn't to look at 2016, what do we do now? The infrastructure challenge is to look to the future, help to create it, but also anticipate the future, get ahead of the game. The problem in this country has been that infrastructure has lagged behind development. What we need to do is to make sure, and I'm not arguing the high-speed rail line would be open in the next term of the Labor government. This is a long-term project, quite clearly. Our study identified 2031 as the date, and that was a 2012 study. So it was looking at the process in terms of planning. But I tell you what, if you don't establish an authority now, and you don't preserve the corridor now, the actions of today will stop what should happen tomorrow, because it won't be possible. And that's what good infrastructure planning is about. That's what planning for our cities is about. And that's what the role of government is.
You must be getting a lot of resistance.
Anticipate
you must
that.
be getting a lot of resistance, though, from the airport authorities, from Virgin and Qantas. They must be lobbying hard against this sort of scheme.
Well, in terms, not at all. I think they understand that there's different markets here. And the growth in terms of aviation is quite extraordinary. We've seen a doubling, for example, in terms of the traffic from China in the last 12 months. That will continue to grow. Our airport and aviation facilities will continue to be necessary. One of the things about hubs like Sydney is that they're important for people who are then travelling onto regional areas as well. So it certainly won't. It's not going to stop the need, for example, for a second Sydney airport, and the second Sydney airport study explicitly looked at this, as did the high-speed rail study. We're a more mobile population. If you think about, 20 years ago, even when I was elected to Parliament, there's been a transformation. My first air trip was as a ministerial advisor to Canberra. Let me assure you, my son, who's 15, has been on a lot of planes in his life, and so have all of his friends. The nature of society is changing. Infrastructure has to not just keep up with it, it has to get ahead of it. And that's what a high-speed rail project is about, showing that vision.
Just on cities policy in general, you were critical of the government earlier for downgrading the portfolio, but what constitutional authority does the federal government actually have over cities? I mean, surely it's very hard for a federal government to make, to micromanage cities. I mean, it's clearly a state government responsibility, and we do have a problem with the federation. I think even the Labor Party admits that. And so surely if you've got Canberra meddling in the design of railways and so forth, this is going to further undermine the problem we already have.
Not at all, Adam, but it certainly is the case that planning is the responsibility of the states and territories. But there's great examples of whereby the Commonwealth playing a role, showing that national leadership, where 4 out of 5 Australians live, where 80% of our economic activity comes from, not from rural or regional areas or mining, 80% comes from cities. And that's why it's vitally important for our national economic story to get it right. There's great examples in the past of the Whitlam government, of Brian Howe's Better Cities program, the honeysuckle development. Pyrmont Ultimo has been transformed. That would not have occurred without the involvement of Brian Howe and the Better Cities program. East Perth, right around the country there's examples of that. But there's also examples of funding. And state governments come to federal government all the time asking for dollars for transport infrastructure. Well, it shouldn't be just a case of here's the dollars and the only key performance indicator of the Commonwealth is has the money got out the door. It should be, okay, you want to talk about a rail line. Where are the jobs coming along that rail line? What's the development along that rail line? How is it improving sustainability of a city along that rail corridor as well? All of those things mean that the national government can play a key role in partnership with state and local governments and the private sector in shaping the nature of our cities.
Anthony Albanese, we are out of time. We appreciate you finding the time to talk to us here in the studio. Thanks for your company.
Great to be with you.